I'm James Crossley, and I presented my paper at the recent CenSAMM conference on Interwar apocalypticism on John Ball, priest of the 1381 Uprising and Seer of Interwar England, and this is written up in more detail in my forthcoming book with Equinox called Spectres of John Ball, the Peasants' Revolt in English Political History 1381 to 2020. In Interwar England, the reception of Ball, the most famous priest of the 1381 Uprising, typically viewed him as a hero and originator of English socialism. At this point, the reception of Ball was almost inevitably the reception of Ball by way of William Morris's A Dream of John Ball, where the narrator goes from the late 19th century and back to the 14th century and meets Ball. The narrator functions as a seer, a visionary explaining the future transformations of history. Morris's Marxist and secularized eschatology had Ball as a foil for understanding the transformation of human history beyond capitalism, and this formed the basis of future receptions of Morris's work. The interwar reception of this historical schema gets developed or even altered in different and competing ways when concerning the future transformation of England. But what these presentations typically have in common is the idea of Ball, not Morris's narrator, as a secularized seer or prophet, with some notable nuances. It's probably fair to say that the interwar presentation of Ball was dominated by semi-official or even official Communist Party and Labour Party presentations, particularly in the 1930s in the face of the threat of fascism. But that's for another occasion. Here I want to focus on two presentations from the 1920s, though both clearly influenced by socialist understandings. Ball in these presentations is presented as a religious virtuoso, perhaps even connected with the supernatural world. This seems an unusual move in what was then an increasingly secularized reception history of Ball, but I argued that they are examples of modifying the conventional secularized reception of Ball for specific audiences. Decorated in Morris-style floral patterns and with a promise to use only words originating in Middle English, William Chandler's play 1381, an English tragedy from 1927, was dedicated to Morris. Much of the play owes something to the reception of Morris, but there was something different about 1381. The backdrop of the horrors of war and sacrifices made by soldiers told through the tellingly named Tommy, echoing of course the nickname for English soldiers in World War I. Ball becomes the seer who people think has come from heaven and exits the stage as one seeing a vision. This visual portrayal is important, as we'll see, but for now we should note that this visionary John Ball is a familiar updating of a secularized and politicized understanding. 1381 presents Ball as having the unenviable and mysterious knowledge of knowing that the revolt may very well be a catastrophic failure, but that the hope still continues throughout the centuries for a future of liberty and socialism. 1381 acts as an encouragement that things will change no matter how desperate the present seems. Ball and a fellow leader die like soldiers in the same way as Tommy's friends did at war, hands clasped, eye to eye as martyrs. But they do so in the knowledge that whatever else happens, the future ultimately bringeth full abiding peace. Chandler presents the revolt as the time when the voice of organised labour was first heard in England, and that around this time appeared, as he says, the first socialist in England, John Ball. What kind of socialist Ball was thought to be was controversial in interwar England, particularly after the Russian Revolution. But that Ball was a martyr and the first English socialist was not. Part of the reason for this was Ball's hopes for the future were a point of contrast with the fate of working classes and ex-soldiers in England after the Great War. One play pushed further the idea of Ball as a figure understood in religious terms. Halcott Glover's popular play, Wat Tyler, a play in 3 acts, from 1921. In Glover's play, Ball is thin and pale and white-faced and weak, and this was not just due to his stint in prison. It's part of Ball's persona as a kind of religious virtuoso. Glover's near-saintly Ball has dreams and visions and describes himself as a seeing man. This behaviour is trance-like, something akin to a fit. For when he does have a vision, he's described as possessed. His ringing utterance is that of a prophet, lifting his wasted arms, his voice ringing out loud and inspired. This partly accounts for the description of Ball as mad. Usually in the history of reception, Ball is deemed mad because he was making claims far ahead of his time that people could not comprehend. In Glover's play, Ball is deemed mad because of his trance-like states. This is certainly a striking moment in the history of reception of Ball, but I'd say it's not that disconnected from the usual political readings of John Ball. Glover's presentation of Ball echoes biblical notions and discussed in biblical scholarship at the time of the prophet, of ecstatic prophecy, prophetic deprivation, and the potential for these phenomena to be classified as madness. The biblical prophet was the model for Ball as prophet elsewhere. Glover, I would argue, is just expanding the notion to include their less conventional behaviours, physical gestures. But Glover's presentation of Ball also recalled the behaviour of recognisable interwar religious virtuosi in an era of theosophy, spiritualism, mediums, occultism, that crossed the political spectrum and were not necessarily seen as antithetical to scientific, socialist, or even secularised understandings of the world. I think it's worth adding that in this context, Glover's play seems to have been popular and revised for open-air performances. These were not simply playing to a secular socialist audience, but to a wider public audience, which meant that broader and visual understandings of profit were perhaps even required to make the point. And this is why in the earlier play we looked at, I think we get the idea of Ball leaving the stage as one seeing a vision. It's portraying Ball in visual terms so that the audience can see that this is a prophet. But in socialist terms, in secularized terms, which also feed into these understandings, it's a certain kind of prophet. Not necessarily one understood as religious or directly involved with the supernatural world, but one who can see the transformation away from capitalism to a socialist future.